The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the small town of Silverstone, a dusty outpost on the edge of the Arizona Territory. Clara Richardson stood on the wooden porch of her father's general store, shielding her eyes from the glare as she watched the stagecoach roll into town, wheels kicking up clouds of golden dust. At 22, Clara was known throughout the county for her gentle nature and striking beauty honey blonde hair, eyes the color of a summer sky, and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. "Clara, those supplies ain't going to inventory themselves," her father called from inside the store. "Coming, Pa," she replied, stealing one last glance at the stagecoach before returning to the dimly lit interior. Samuel Richardson had raised Clara alone after her mother died of fever when she was just 8 years old. He was a good man, strict but fair, and fiercely protective of his only daughter. The general store had prospered under his careful management, making them one of the more well-to-do families in Silverstone. "Did you see who arrived on the coach?" Samuel asked, marking entries in his ledger. "No, Pa. Just saw it pull up to the hotel." "Well, word is the Blackwood gang's been spotted near Rattlesnake Canyon. Sheriff Taylor's asking folks to stay close to town." Clara nodded, though the warning hardly seemed necessary. The Blackwood gang had been terrorizing towns across the territory for months, robbing banks, looting stagecoaches, and worse. By the notorious James Blackwood, they'd earned a reputation for cruelty that made even hardened outlaws shudder. As Clara counted sacks of flour in the storeroom, she heard the bell above the shop door jingle. Voices drifted back to her father's familiar baritone and another, rougher voice that sent an inexplicable chill down her spine. "Fine selection you got here," the stranger was saying. "Been on the trail a long time. Need some supplies." Clara peered through the crack in the storeroom door. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a black hat pulled low over his face. His duster coat was covered in trail dust, and a revolver hung visibly at his hip. "We've got everything you might need," her father replied, his voice carrying a hint of wariness that Clara rarely heard. The stranger moved around the store, selecting items and placing them on the counter: ammunition, coffee, tobacco, canned beans, and jerky. When he reached the display of whiskey bottles, he selected the most expensive one. "Celebrating something?" Samuel asked as he tallied the purchases. The stranger smiled, revealing teeth stained by tobacco. "You might say that. Big plans coming. Together soon." Clara watched as her father wrapped the purchases. Something about the stranger made her uneasy, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the way his eyes seemed to take in every detail of the store, lingering on the strongbox behind the counter. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The summer heat pressed down on the town like a wool blanket, making the air inside her bedroom stifling despite the open window. She rose from her bed, poured water from a pitcher into a basin, and splashed her face. The cool water was a momentary relief. A sudden noise from downstairs made her freeze. The creak of a floorboard, perhaps, or a door swinging on its hinges. Her father was a sound sleeper. It wouldn't be him moving about at this hour. Clara slipped on her robe and moved quietly to the door, listening. More sounds now definite. Movements downstairs in the store. Thieves, most likely. It had happened before, though rarely. Sheriff Taylor had run off most of the petty criminals. Years ago, she reached for the small derringer her father had insisted she keep by her bedside. A lady should always be prepared, he'd said when he gave it to her on her 20th birthday. She'd never fired it outside of practice, but its weight in her hand was reassuring. The hallway was dark as she crept toward the stairs, guided only by the faint moonlight streaming through a window. The noises were clearer, now voices, low and urgent. More than one person, then. "Hurry up," a man's voice hissed. "Get the strongbox." "It's locked," another replied. Then wake the old man and make him open it. Clara's heart thundered in her chest. She had to warn her father. She turned to rush to his room when a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. The voices downstairs fell silent. "Someone's awake," the first voice said. "Check upstairs." Panic seized her. Clara rushed to her father's room, but before she could reach the door, heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs behind her. She turned, raising the derringer with trembling hands. A dark figure appeared at the top of the stairs, the stranger from earlier that day, now with a bandana pulled up over his face. Only his eyes were visible, cold and calculating in the darkness. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Looks like the little lady's awake." Clara pulled the trigger. The derringer barked, the sound deafening in the confined space. The stranger cursed and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, but didn't fall. Clara turned to run, but another man appeared at the end of the hallway, blocking her path. Her father's door burst open. Samuel Richardson stood there in his nightshirt, shotgun in hand. "Clara, get back." Everything happened so fast. The wounded man lunged forward, despite his injury. Samuel fired, the shotgun's roar filling the hallway with thunder and smoke. The second man fired his revolver. Samuel fell backward, crimson blossoming on his nightshirt. "PA!" Clara screamed, rushing to him. Rough hands grabbed her from behind. A cloth pressed against her face, smelling of something sweet and chemical. She struggled, but the world began to blur around the edges. The last thing she heard was her father's weak voice calling her name as darkness claimed her. When Clara awoke, her head pounding and mouth dry as cotton, she was no longer in her home. The rhythmic swaying and the clatter of hooves told her she was in a moving wagon. Her hands were bound before her with rough rope that chafed her wrists. Fear clutched at her heart as memories flooded back the intruders, the gunshot, her father. Falling. "Pa," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Was he dead? Had she been taken by the very Blackwood gang her father had warned her about? The canvas covering the wagon let in thin streams of sunlight, enough for her to see she wasn't alone. A man sat opposite her, rifle across his lap, watching her with cold eyes. "She's awake," he called to someone outside. The wagon slowed to a stop. A moment later, the canvas at the back was pulled aside, flooding the space with harsh sunlight that made Clara wince. "Well, good morning, sunshine," a voice drawled. As her eyes adjusted, she recognized the man from the store, the one she'd shot. His arm was crudely bandaged, a dark stain visible on the cloth. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. Jane's is gonna like you. Who? Who are you? What do you want with me?" Clara's voice was hoarse. The man grinned. "Name's Hank. And what do we want?" "Well, that's simple. Your Pay's store was just a bonus. You're the real prize." "My father." "Best not think about that now," Hank said, his tone suddenly cold. "You're Blackwood's property now. And he doesn't take kindly to damaged goods, so behave yourself." Clara felt her blood run cold. James Blackwood the Notorious, outlaw whose name was whispered with fear throughout the territory. And now she was his property? "I'll die before I belong to anyone," she said, lifting her chin defiantly despite her fear. Hank laughed. "Spirited indeed. We'll see how long that lasts." The journey continued for what felt like days, though it was hard for Clara to track time. They traveled mostly at night, resting during the hottest parts of the day in whatever shade they could find. She learned there were 4 of them, Hank, the leader of this small group. Mick, a rat-faced man with yellowed teeth who leered at her whenever Hank wasn't looking. Tomas, a massive, silent man who seemed to take no pleasure in her capture. And a young boy called Rusty, who couldn't have been more than 16. They fed her just enough to keep her alive, and allowed her water when they stopped. Her requests to clean herself, or for privacy, were met with mocking laughter. Only Thomas showed her any kindness, once loosening her bonds when the others weren't looking, and slipping her an extra piece of jerky. On what she guessed was the third day, they entered rough, mountainous country. The wagon struggled up narrow trails, jolting and swaying alarmingly over the uneven ground. How much further? She heard Rusty ask as they made camp that evening. We'll reach Devil's Backbone tomorrow. Hank replied. Blackwood and the others are waiting there. Clara huddled against the wagon wheel where they'd tied her for the night. Devil's Backbone, she'd heard of it. A notorious hideout for outlaws, deep in the mountains where no lawman dared venture. If they reached it, any hope of rescue would vanish like morning dew under the desert sun-dot as night fell, and the men settled around the campfire. Clara tested her bonds. Tomas had tied them, and whether by accident or design, they were looser than usual. If she could just slip free, perhaps she could steal a horse and escape under cover of darkness. But as the ropes began to give way, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp. The men fell silent, hands moving to their weapons. Probably just a coyote, Mick said after a moment. Check it out, Hank ordered. Nodding to Thomas. The big man rose silently, rifle in hand, and disappeared into the darkness. Seconds stretched into minutes. Clara held her breath, still working at her bonds. A gunshot shattered the silence, followed by a cry of pain. Ambush! Hank shouted, diving for cover as more shots rang out. Want to find out what happens next? Hit like and subscribe to our channel. The adventure continues in Chapter 2, coming soon. Chapter 2. Welcome back to our epic Western adventure. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling tales from the Wild West. Chaos erupted in the camp as bullets whizzed through the air. Hank and Mick returned fire, shooting at shadows beyond the circle of firelight. Rusty, panicked and inexperienced, fired wildly into the darkness. Clara worked frantically at her bonds, the men too distracted by the attack to notice her efforts. The ropes finally gave way, just as Mick fell backward with a grunt, a dark stain spreading across his chest. It's just one man, Hank shouted, ducking behind a boulder. Flank him, Rusty. One man? Clara couldn't believe it. Who would be foolish enough to attack 4 armed outlaws alone? Using the confusion as cover, she scrambled behind the wagon, staying low. If she could reach the horses. A hand suddenly clamped over her mouth. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled against a calloused palm. Quiet, a voice whispered in her ear. I'm not with them. I'm here to help you. The hand slowly released her. Clara turned to see a man crouched beside her, his face hidden in shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He wore a dusty duster coat, and a bandana covered the lower half of his face. Who are you? She whispered. Name's Sam Riley. No time for proper introductions. Can you ride? Yes, but another volley of gunfire interrupted her. The stranger Sam pulled her lower to the ground as bullets splintered the wagon above. Them. Listen carefully, he said, his voice urgent but calm. I've got a horse hidden behind those rocks. He pointed to a rocky outcropping about 50 yards away. When I start shooting again, you run there and don't stop for anything. Understand? Clara nodded, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Ready? Sam checked his revolver. On 3. 1.2. 3. He stood suddenly, firing rapidly at Hank and Rusty's positions. Clara sprinted across the open ground, expecting any moment to feel a bullet in her back. The distance seemed to stretch endlessly before her, but finally she reached the rocks and collapsed behind them, gasping for breath. A gray horse was indeed tethered there, stamping nervously at the sound of gunfire. Clara stroked its neck, trying to calm it and herself. More shots rang out, then silence. Had Sam been hit? Should she flee alone? Before she could decide, she heard footsteps approaching. She pressed herself against the rock, preparing to run if it wasn't Sam. "It's me," his voice came, low and reassuring. He appeared around the edge of the rocks, reloading his revolver. "Hank's dead." Rusty ran off. "Tomas?" Clara asked. "The big fella?" "Wounded, not dead. Left him be. He didn't seem the same as the others." Sam untied the horse and helped Clara mount before swinging up behind her. "We need to put distance between us and this place. Rusty might bring back more men." They rode hard through the night, the horse sure-footed despite the darkness and rough terrain. Clara was acutely aware of Sam's presence behind her, his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to hold the reins. Despite her ordeal, or perhaps because of it, she found his proximity both unsettling and reassuring. As the first light of dawn broke over the eastern mountains, they reached a small, hidden valley with a stream running through it. Sam finally reined in the exhausted horse. "We'll rest here a while," he said, dismounting and helping Clara down. "Should be safe enough for now." Now, in the growing light, Clara could finally see her rescuer clearly as he removed his bandana and hat. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair and a short beard streaked with premature gray. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he'd once smiled easily, though there was little humor in his expression now. Most striking were his eyes, a deep, stormy gray that seemed to hold secrets and sorrows beyond counting. A long scar ran from his right temple down to his jaw, pale against his tanned skin. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to action, but there was a slight stiffness to his left shoulder that suggested an old injury. "Thank you," Clara said, suddenly realizing she hadn't properly expressed her gratitude. "You saved my life." Sam nodded curtly. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Clara replied. "Most would have ridden the other way. Why did you help me?" He busied himself unsaddling the horse, avoiding her gaze. "Heard about a woman being taken by part of Blackwood's gang. Figured it wasn't right. How did you find us?" "Been tracking them for days." He led the horse to the stream to drink. "Get some rest. We've got a long ride ahead." Clara had 1,000 more questions, but exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed her. Using Sam's saddle as a pillow, she lay down on a patch of soft grass and was asleep almost instantly. She woke to the smell of coffee. The sun was high overhead. She'd slept for hours. Sam sat by a small, nearly smokeless fire, a battered coffee pot nestled in the coals. He was cleaning a rifle with practiced efficiency. "Hope you like your coffee strong," he said without looking up. Clara sat up, wincing at her stiff muscles. "I didn't mean to sleep so long. Needed it." He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. "There's jerky in my saddlebag if you're hungry." The coffee was indeed strong, but the warmth and bitterness were welcome. As she sipped, Clara studied Sam more carefully. He didn't look like any hero from the dime novels, no flashy pistols or pristine clothing. Everything about him spoke of practicality and hard use. Yet there was something in the way he held himself, a kind of coiled intensity that suggested he was more than just a drifter. "You're not a lawman," she said finally. It wasn't a question. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, ma'am." "Far from it. Then why go against Blackwood's men?" "Everyone knows they're dangerous." Sam was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were talking about someone else entirely. "I rode with them once. Years ago." Clara nearly choked on her coffee. "You were part of the Blackwood gang?" "Not by choice, at first." His hands continued their mechanical work on the rifle. I was young, stupid. Got caught stealing a horse when I was 17. The owner, a rancher named Phillips, was going to hang me. James Blackwood happened to be passing through with his men. Shot Phillips dead and told me I could either join them or die alongside the rancher. He reassembled the rifle with quick, precise movements. Didn't seem like much of a choice at the time. How long were you with them? Clara asked, trying to reconcile this quiet, competent man with the brutal outlaws who had kidnapped her. 5 years. Too long. Sam's jaw tightened. Did things I'm not proud of. Things that haunt me still. What changed? Sam stared into the fire, his expression hardening. Blackwood's always been cruel, but as time went on, he got worse. Started enjoying hurting people. Women, children didn't matter to him. He looked up at Clara, his gray eyes intense. There was a raid on a small homestead. Family with 3 young children. Blackwood. He wanted to make an example of them. He fell silent again, and Clara didn't press him to continue. Whatever had happened at that homestead had been the breaking point. I couldn't stand by anymore. He said finally, tried to stop it. Got this for my trouble. He traced the scar on his face. Blackwood left me for dead. When I recovered, I swore I'd put an end to him and his gang, one way or another. You've been hunting them ever since? Sam nodded. 3 years now. I've picked off some of his men, disrupted their plans when I could. But Blackwood himself is always just out of reach. And now? Why risk your life for a stranger? Clara asked. Softly, Sam packed the rifle away, his movements deliberate. When I heard they'd taken a woman from Silverstone, I knew what that meant. Blackwood has ... tastes. No woman deserves that fate. Clara shuddered, understanding the implication. My father ... they shot him when they took me. I don't know if he survived. I'm sorry, Sam said, and there was genuine compassion in his voice. Once you're safe, we can try to find out. Safe where? I can't go home if they're still looking. For me, I know a place. Small settlement called Pine Haven, about 3 days' ride from here. Got a friend there, a widow named Martha, who runs a boarding house. She'll take you in while I deal with Blackwood. Clara straightened her spine. I'm not hiding while you go after them alone. They killed my father, or at least tried to. I want justice. Sam's expression darkened. This isn't about justice, Clara. It's about survival. Blackwood has over 20 men with him now, all killers. This isn't something you want any part of. I already am part of it, she insisted. And I'm a better shot than you might think. My father made sure of that. It doesn't matter. I work alone. You didn't seem to mind my help when we were escaping. Sam stood abruptly. We should move. We've stayed in one place too long. As he saddled the horse, Clara realized she'd hit a nerve. This man, his former outlaw turned vengeful hunter, was used to keeping people at a distance. Perhaps he thought it safer that way for them, or for himself. They rode through the afternoon, keeping to rough country where they'd be harder to track. Sam was quiet, speaking only to point out landmarks or potential dangers. Clara used the time to observe him more closely. Despite his gruff manner, there was an underlying gentleness in how he handled the horse, how he helped her over difficult terrain. Whatever he'd done in his past, she sensed he was a man trying. To make amends. As dusk approached, Sam led them to a small cave hidden behind a stand of junipers. We'll spend the night here, he said, dismounting. Less visible than a fire in the open. The cave was shallow but dry. Sam unsaddled the horse and secured it nearby, then unrolled his bedroll inside the cave. Take this, he said, offering it to Clara. I'll keep watch. You need rest too, she protested. I'm used to going without. Clara sat on the bedroll, watching as Sam positioned himself at the cave entrance, rifle across his knees. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft nickering of the horse and the distant cry of a coyote. "Tell me about Silverstone," Sam said suddenly. "About your life before." The request surprised her. "Why?" He shrugged. "Helps to remember there's normal places, normal lives out there. Sometimes I forget." So Clara told him about growing up in Silverstone, about her father's store, about the small community that had been her world. She described the church socials, the cattle drives that would bring cowboys to town, the schoolhouse where she taught the younger children for a time. "Sounds peaceful," Sam said when she finished. There was a wistfulness in his voice that tugged at her heart. "It was," she agreed. "What about you? Where did you come from before before everything?" Sam was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "Farm. In Nebraska. Parents died of fever when I was 14. Had a younger sister, Emma. We were sent to different relatives. Lost track of her." His hands tightened on the rifle. "That's why I stole that horse. Was going to find her." "Have you looked for her since?" "Tried years ago. Trail went cold." His tone made it clear. The subject was closed. Another silence fell, but it felt less strained now. Clara studied Sam's profile, outlined against the deepening twilight outside the cave. There was a loneliness about him that went bone deep. How long had he been hunting Blackwood? How long since he'd had someone to talk to, someone who saw him as more than an outlaw or a threat? "You should sleep," Sam said, without turning. "Dawn comes early." Clara lay down, but sleep eluded her. Her mind was filled with images of her father, falling, bleeding. Hank's cruel smile. Sam emerging from the darkness like an avenging angel. And beneath it all, a growing awareness that her life would never be the same again. "Sam?" she whispered. "HM? Thank you. Not just for rescuing me, but for telling me your story." He didn't respond, but she saw his shoulders relax slightly. It was enough. The next morning, they set out at first light. Sam seemed to have a destination in mind, leading them steadily north through increasingly rugged terrain. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a vast canyon. In the distance, Clara could see the thin ribbon of a river winding through the red stone landscape. "Devil's Backbone," Sam said, nodding toward a jagged line of cliffs on the far side of the canyon. "Blackwood's main hideout is in those caves." Clara felt a chill despite the heat of the day. "That's where they were taking me?" Sam nodded grimly. "We'll go around. There's a trading post about 10 miles east of here. We can get supplies, maybe another horse. Won't that be dangerous? If Blackwood's men are looking for us." "It's run by a Navajo man named Sosi. He has no love for Blackwood or his kind. We'll be safe there." They were making their way down a narrow trail when Sam suddenly raised his hand, signaling Clara to stop. He tilted his head, listening intently. Clara heard it too, the distant sound of horses approaching. "Quick," Sam whispered, leading her off the trail and into a dense thicket of scrub oak. They crouched low, the horse hidden behind them. Minutes later, a group of riders appeared on the trail above them. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she recognized Rusty among them. Beside him rode a man she hadn't seen before, tall and lean, with a shock of white blonde hair visible beneath his hat. He carried himself with an air of authority that made her blood run cold. "That's him," Sam breathed, his voice barely audible. "Blackwood?" Clara studied the outlaw leader. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, and handsome in a sharp, predatory way. His eyes constantly scanned the landscape as he spoke to Rusty, who gestured animatedly, clearly, recounting the attack on their camp. "Spread out," Blackwood ordered, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "They can't have gone far. I want the woman alive." The man double quotes, his lips curved in a cold smile. "Bring me his head." The riders dispersed, several of them heading down. The very trail Clara and Sam had been following. Sam slowly reached for his rifle. "What are you doing?" Clara whispered urgently. "I could end it right here. One shot. And then his men would hunt us down immediately. We wouldn't stand a chance." Sam's jaw tightened, but he lowered the rifle. "You're right. We need to move now." They waited until the riders were out of sight, and quickly mounted and headed east, staying off the trails and using every bit of cover the landscape offered. Sam pushed the horse hard, knowing they needed to reach Soshi's trading post before Blackwood's men caught up with them. As the sun began to set, a small cluster of buildings appeared in the distant Soshi's trading post. It was a humble establishment. A main building constructed of adobe and logs, a corral for livestock, and several smaller outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcoming sight after their tense journey. Sam approached cautiously, scanning for any sign of Blackwoods. Men. When he was satisfied it was safe, he urged the horse forward. An elderly Navajo man emerged from the main building as they approached. He was lean and straight-backed despite his years, with a face deeply lined by sun and time. His dark eyes widened slightly at the sight of Sam. "Clizzy," he said, using what Clara assumed was a Navajo name for Sam. "It has been many seasons." "Too many, old friend," Sam replied, dismounting and helping Clara down. "We need help, Sosi. Blackwood's men are after us." Soshi's expression darkened. "Come inside, quickly. If you're enjoying this exciting adventure, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to catch the thrilling conclusion in Chapter 3. Your support means everything to us. Chapter 3. Thank you for returning to our Western adventure. If you've been enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing with friends who love tales of the Wild West. The interior of Soshi's trading post was warm and surprisingly comfortable. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned goods to ammunition, blankets to medicine. A potbelly stove in the center of the room radiated welcome heat, chasing away the evening chill. Soshi's wife, a small woman with bright, intelligent eyes and silver hair pulled back in a bun, quickly prepared food for them, a hearty stew of rabbit and wild onions. With fresh bread, it made Clara realize how hungry she truly was. As they ate, Sam explained their situation to Sosi, who listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if certain details confirmed what he already knew. "Blackwood grows bold," the older man said when Sam finished. "His men raid our hunting grounds, threaten our people. Many fear to travel the old paths now." "He's getting worse," Sam agreed. "More men, more guns. The territorial marshals can't or won't touch him." Sosi studied Sam thoughtfully. "And you, Clizzy? Still you hunt alone? Still you carry this burden by yourself?" Sam looked away, uncomfortable under the older man's penetrating gaze. "It's my fight, Sosi." "No man's fight is his alone," Sosi replied. "This I have told you before." Clara glanced between them, sensing a long-standing disagreement. "What does that name mean?" she asked. "The one you call him?" A smile touched Soshi's weathered face. "Clizzy. It means little goat in our tongue, because when I first met this one, he was stubborn, inclined where others would not go." Despite the tension of their situation, Clara couldn't help smiling at the image of a young, stubborn Sam earning such a nickname. "We need supplies," Sam said, clearly wanting to change the subject. "And another horse, if you have one to spare." "I'll pay fair." "You will stay the night," Soshi's wife, Nijoni, insisted. "Rest. Tomorrow is soon enough to continue your journey." Sam started to protest, but Sosie raised a hand. Blackwood's men will not come here tonight. I have sent my grandsons to watch the trails. We will have warning if anyone approaches. Reluctantly, Sam agreed. Nijoni showed Clara to a small back room with a clean, comfortable pallet. Rest well, daughter of the sunrise, she said kindly, using a term that Clara assumed referred to her blonde hair. Exhausted as she was, Clara found herself lying awake, listening to the murmur of male voices from the main room. Sam and Sosie were still talking, their conversation occasionally punctuated by long silences. Though she couldn't make out the words, she sensed they were discussing something of great importance. Finally, silence fell over the trading post. Clara closed her eyes, trying to quiet her racing mind. So much had happened in such a short time: her kidnapping, her father's shooting, her rescue by a former outlaw with a mysterious past. And now they were being hunted by one of the most dangerous men in the territory. What would happen when they reached Pine Haven? Would Sam simply leave her there and continue his vendetta alone? The thought troubled her more than she wanted to admit. Sleep finally claimed her, but her dreams were troubled images of her father, bleeding on the floor, of Blackwood's cold smile, of Sam standing alone against an army of shadows. She woke at dawn to find the trading post already bustling with activity. Sosie and his grandsons, two young men with the same watchful eyes as their grandfather, were loading supplies onto a pack-horse. Sam was checking the saddle on a sturdy paint mare that would be Clara's mount. No sign of Blackwood's men, Sam told her as she joined them outside. But they're out there. We need to move quickly. Clara noticed Sam had acquired new weapons, a Winchester rifle in a scabbard on his saddle, and what looked like a Colt Peacemaker at his hip, replacing his older revolver. Gifts, Sosie explained, seeing her glance. The weapons of a warrior. Should be worthy of his fight. Sam seemed embarrassed by the old man's words, but accepted the gifts with genuine gratitude. Clara suspected there was more to their relationship than she understood. A shared history that had forged a bond deeper than friendship. As they prepared to depart, Nijoni approached Clara with a bundle. Clothes, she explained. A dress is not good for long riding. These will serve you better. The bundle contained buckskin pants, a cotton shirt, and a warm jacket, all slightly too large for her, but far more practical than her torn and dirty dress. Thank you, Clara said, touched by the woman's thoughtfulness. You watch over Clizzy Yahtzee, Nijoni said quietly. His heart is strong but wounded. He forgets he is not alone in this world. Before Clara could respond, Sam called that they were ready to leave. She quickly changed into the new clothes, feeling both strange and liberated in the practical garments. They set off just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the land. Sam led them northward, away from Devil's Backbone and toward Pine Haven. With two fresh horses, they made good time, covering ground quickly while still remaining vigilant. Around midday, they paused in a sheltered arroyo to rest the horses and eat some of the food Nijoni had packed for them: dried meat, cornbread, and dried berries. How much further to Pine Haven? Clara asked, sipping water from a canteen. 2 days, maybe less if we push hard, Sam replied. He seemed distracted, constantly scanning their surroundings. And then what? You leave me with this Martha person and go hunting Blackwood alone? Sam met her gaze, his gray eyes unreadable. That was the plan. And if I don't agree to that plan? A muscle worked in his jaw. This isn't a debate, Clara. Blackwood is dangerous, more dangerous than you know. I know exactly how dangerous he is, she retorted. I've seen what his men are capable of. They shot my father and kidnapped me. They would have ... double quotes. She couldn't finish the thought. That's why you need to be somewhere safe. And what about you? Don't you deserve safety too? Sam looked away. I gave up that right a long time ago. Clara moved closer to him, forcing him to meet her eyes. You're punishing yourself for things you did when you had no choice. How long will that continue? Until Blackwood kills you? Until you've hunted down every last one of his men? You don't understand. I understand that you saved my life, she interrupted. I understand that whatever you did in the past, you're trying to make it right. But getting yourself killed won't bring back anyone Blackwood has hurt. Sam's expression hardened. Drop it, Clara. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight when you rescued me. Now we're in this together. Before he could respond, one of the horses nickered nervously. Sam was instantly alert, hand moving to his new revolver. Something's wrong, he whispered, rising into a crouch. Clara followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual in the barren landscape surrounding their sheltered position. Then she heard it. The faint sound of horse hooves on stone got Sam, motioned for her to stay down as he crept to the edge of the arroyo, peering carefully over the rim. His body tensed, and he quickly ducked back down. Riders, he whispered. 4 of them heading this way. Blackwood's men. Clara's heart raced. Did they see you? Don't think so. But they're following our trail. Sam quickly gathered their supplies. We need to move now. If we can reach the canyon ahead, we might lose them. They mounted as quietly as possible and led the horses carefully along the bottom of the arroyo, away from the approaching riders. The walls of the dry stream provided cover, but also hemmed them in, limiting their options if they were discovered. As they rounded a bend in the arroyo, Sam suddenly reined in his horse. Ahead of them, the arroyo narrowed dramatically, becoming little more than a crack in the earth, too tight for the horses to pass through. We'll have to go up and over, Sam decided, pointing to a place where the arroyo wall sloped less steeply. They urged the horses up the sandy incline, the animals struggling for purchase on the loose soil. Just as they reached the rim, a shout rang out behind them. There they are, Sam swore under his breath. Ride, he ordered Clara. Head for those rocks. He pointed to a jumble of massive boulders about half a mile ahead. They spurred their horses to a gallop, bullets kicking up dust around them as Blackwood's men opened fire. The distance to the rocks seemed impossible, the open ground offering no cover. Clara bent low over her horse's neck, heart hammering with each stride. A cry of pain from beside her made her turn. Sam was clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. Despite his wound, he kept riding, his face a mask of determination. They reached the rocks just as another volley of bullets whizzed past them. Sam dismounted awkwardly, pulling Clara down beside him and leading the horses deeper into the maze of boulders. You're hit, she said, reaching for his bloodied shirt. It's nothing, he grunted. Just a graze. But as he slumped against a boulder, Clara could see it was more serious than he admitted. The bullet had caught him in the side, leaving a deep furrow across his ribs. Blood soaked his shirt and ran down to his waistband. We need to stop the bleeding, she insisted, tearing a strip from her shirt. No time. They'll be on us soon. Sam checked his weapons, wincing with the movement. Take the horses and keep going north. You'll see a line of cliffs follow them east until you reach a narrow pass. On the other side is a valley. Pine Haven is there. I'm not leaving you, Clara said firmly, pressing the makeshift bandage against his wound. Damn it, woman. This is no time for stubbornness. Sam's voice was tight with pain and frustration. Exactly what I was about to say to you, she retorted. We either get out of this together or not at all. The sound of approaching horses silenced their argument. Sam moved to the edge of their rocky shelter, peering out cautiously. They're spreading out, trying to surround us, he reported. 4 of them, like I thought. Rusty's there, and a man I know, Carson. Mean as a rattlesnake and twice as deadly. What's the plan? Clara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sam considered for a moment. We need to thin them out. I'll draw their fire. Get them to focus on me. You circle around behind them. And then what? I've never shot a man, Sam. His eyes softened slightly. I hope you won't have to. Just create a distraction fire into the air. Make them think we have more people. It might give us the chance we need to escape. It wasn't much of a plan, but they had few options. Sam showed her how to circle through the rocks to come up behind their pursuers, then checked her revolver to ensure it was fully loaded. Wait. For my signal, he instructed. When you hear me engage them, count to 30, then fire 3 shots into the air. Clara nodded, her mouth dry with fear. As she prepared to leave their shelter, Sam caught her arm. Be careful, he said, his gray eyes intense. If anything goes wrong, don't wait for me. Just ride for Pine Haven. Nothing will go wrong, she insisted, with more confidence than she felt. She made her way through the labyrinth of boulders, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. The terrain was treacherous loose stones that could twist an ankle, narrow gaps that scraped her skin as she squeezed through. But gradually she worked her way around to the position Sam had indicated. From her new vantage point, she could see Blackwood's men more clearly. They had dismounted and were approaching the spot where she'd left Sam, spreading out to cover all possible escape routes. Rusty was easy to recognize, young and nervous, his rifle held awkwardly as he advanced. The man Sam had called Carson was clearly the leader, gesturing commands to the others with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Clara's heart pounded as she watched them close in on Sam's position. Where was he? Had he moved, or was he still hiding where she'd left him? The answer came in a deafening barrage of gunfire. Sam had opened fire from a different position than where they parted, catching Carson and his men in a crossfire. One of the outlaws fell immediately, clutching his chest. The others dove for cover, returning fire. Clara began counting. 1, 2, 3. The seconds crawled by as the gunfight intensified below. Another of Blackwood's men cried out and fell, but Carson and Rusty had found good positions and were laying down heavy fire in Sam's direction at 20-8, 29-30. Clara raised her revolver and fired 3 shots into the air, the sound deafening in the enclosed space between the boulders. The effect was immediate. Carson and Rusty, believing they were being attacked from behind, turned and began firing wildly in her direction. Clara ducked down, heart in her throat as bullets ricocheted off the rocks around her. In the confusion, Sam made his move. He broke from cover and raced toward the horses that Blackwood's men had left at the edge of the boulder field. Despite his wound, he moved with surprising speed, reaching the horses before Carson realized what was happening. He's going for the horses, Rusty shouted. Carson turned back, but it was too late. Sam had untied the horses and was sending them galloping away with slaps to their rumps. The sight of their escaping mounts drew Carson and Rusty away from their positions, giving Clara the opening she needed to retreat back through the boulders toward their own horses. She reached them just as Sam appeared from another direction, breathing hard and pressing a hand to his bloody side. It worked, he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. Did you doubt it would? Clara asked, helping him onto his horse. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Let's just say I've had better plans. They rode hard, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the stranded outlaws. Sam's wound continued to bleed, and Clara could see the pain etched in the lines of his face. But he refused to stop until they reached a narrow canyon that offered both water and defensible shelter. Now will you let me tend that wound? Clara asked as they dismounted. Sam nodded wearily, too exhausted to argue further. He sat heavily on a boulder as Clara carefully cut away his bloodied shirt. The bullet had carved a deep furrow across his ribs, painful and bloody, but not life-threatening if they could prevent infection. Using water from the stream and supplies from their saddlebags, Clara cleaned the wound as gently as possible. Sam bore the pain stoically, only the occasional sharp intake of breath betraying his discomfort. "Sosie gave me medicine," he said, gesturing to a small pouch in his saddlebag. "Powder made from plants. Prevents the rot." Clara found the pouch and sprinkled the fine powder onto the wound before bandaging it tightly with strips cut from their spare clothes. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Sam watching her, his gray eyes thoughtful. "You handled yourself well back there," he said finally. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Being brave isn't about not feeling fear. It's about what you do despite it." Clara secured the bandage and sat back on her heels. "Is that what keeps you going? Bravery?" Sam looked away. "No, not bravery." "Then what?" He was silent for a long moment, his face troubled. "When I was with Blackwood's gang, there was a raid on a homestead, like I told you before. But I didn't tell you all of it." His voice grew hoarse. "The family had a daughter. Couldn't have been more than 16. Blonde hair, like yours. She reminded me of my sister, Emma." Clara's heart constricted, sensing what was coming. "I tried to stop it," Sam continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "Told Blackwood to leave her be. He laughed, said if I was so concerned, I should wait my turn." His hands clenched into fists. "I drew on him. Never had before, no one did. He was too fast. Shot me. Gave me this." He traced the scar on his face. "Then he made me watch what they did to her and her family before leaving me for dead." A tear slid down his weathered cheek. "So no, it's not bravery that drives me. It's guilt. For all the times I stood by and did nothing. For not being able to save that girl. For every person Blackwood has hurt since then because I failed to stop him." Clara reached out, covering his clenched fist with her hand. "You were one man against many. You tried. It wasn't enough. And getting yourself killed now would be? Would that bring any of them back?" Sam looked at her then, his eyes haunted. "What else can I do? Let him continue? Let him hurt more people?" "We find another way," Clara said firmly. "Together. Why do you care what happens to me?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Because I see the good in you, Sam Riley. Despite everything you've done, everything you've been through, you risked your life for a stranger. That counts for something." He held her gaze for a long moment, then looked away, uncomfortable with her assessment. "We should rest while we can. Still a day's ride to Pine Haven." They made camp in the sheltered canyon, taking turns keeping watch. Through the night. By morning, Sam was feverish, his wound red and hot despite the medicine. Clara insisted they travel slowly, stopping frequently for him to rest. The journey that should have taken a day stretched into 2 as Sam's condition worsened. By the time the valley that held Pine Haven came into view, he was barely conscious, staying in the saddle through sheer determination. Pine Haven was smaller than Clara had expected. Cluster of buildings nestled in a green valley, protected by towering cliffs on 3 sides. A creek ran through the settlement, and fields of crops stretched out behind the buildings. It looked peaceful, untouched by the violence and lawlessness that plagued much of the territory. As they rode into town, people stopped to stare at the strange sight: a woman in buckskins leading a horse, carrying a slumped, bloodied man. An older woman with steel-gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun, emerged from the largest building, shading her eyes against the setting sun. "Martha," Sam managed to call out, his voice weak. "Sam Riley, what trouble have you brought to my doorstep?" "This time?" the woman demanded. though her tone was more concerned than angry. "Need help," Sam replied, before slipping sideways from his saddle. Clara cried out in alarm, but several men rushed forward to catch Sam before he hit the ground. They carried him into the building as Martha turned her attention to Clara. "You must be the reason he's in this state," she said, eyeing Clara critically. "He saved my life," Clara replied, "multiple times." Martha's expression softened slightly. "Well, come in then. I suspect you have quite a story to tell." The following days passed in a blur of anxiety as Sam battled the fever that had taken hold of him. Martha, who turned out to be both the town's innkeeper and its unofficial doctor, treated his wound with poultices and medicines that smelled strongly of herbs and alcohol. Clara rarely left his side, helping to change his bandages and cool his fever with damp cloths. "He's strong," Martha assured her, after a particularly bad night when Sam had thrashed and called out in delirium. "Strongest man I've ever known. He'll pull through." "How do you know him?" Clara asked, curious about the connection between this stern woman and Sam. Martha's weathered face softened with memory. "He saved my son. 3 years ago, Blackwood's men raided a stagecoach my boy was guarding. Shot him and left him for dead. Sam found him, brought him here, stayed until he was healed." "Where is your son now?" "Wyoming. Marshal there. He offered Sam a deputy position, but ... She shrugged. "Sam has his own path to walk." On the 4th day, Sam's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes to find Clara dozing in a chair beside his bed, her hand resting near his on the coverlet. For a long moment, he simply watched her, his expression softening in a way it rarely did when he was fully conscious. "You stayed," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Clara started awake. "You're back," she said, relief washing over her face. "How long was I out?" "4 days. Martha wasn't sure you'd make it." Sam attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wound. "Blackwood is still out there," Clara finished. "For him, and will be waiting when you're properly healed." A commotion outside interrupted them raised voices, the sound of running feet. Martha burst into the room, her face grave. "Riders coming," she announced. About a dozen men, armed to the teeth. "Carson's with them." Sam's face hardened. "Blackwood found us." Martha nodded grimly. "Seems like. Town's preparing to defend itself, but we're mostly farmers here, Sam. Few guns, fewer men who know how to use them." Sam swung his legs over the side of the bed, ignoring Clara's protests. "Help me up. I need to see." Supported between Martha and Clara, Sam made his way to the window. From there, they could see the main street of Pine Haven, where the townspeople were gathering, some with hunting rifles, others with pitchforks and axes. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approach of riders. "Get everyone into the church," Sam ordered. "Stone walls defensible. Martha, you know where I keep my extra ammunition?" "Under the floorboards in the back room," she replied. "All ready." "Got it out." "Good. Clara, you go with Martha." "I'm staying with you," Clara insisted. Sam turned to her, his gray eyes intense. "Not this time. I need to know you're safe." "And I need to know the same about you," she countered. "I'm a good shot. Remember, you're still weak. You need me." For a moment, he looked ready to argue further, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats ended the discussion. "Fine, but you stay behind me." The town had rallied quickly, barricading the main street and positioning armed men at strategic points. Sam, now dressed and armed despite his weakened state, took charge naturally, directing the defense with the confidence of a man who had faced these odds before. As the riders came into view, Clara's heart sank. There were at least 15 of them, all heavily armed. Carson rode at their head, a cruel smile on his face as he surveyed the town's meager defenses. But it was the man beside Carson who sent a chill down Clara's spine. James Blackwood himself, his white blonde hair gleaming in the sunlight. Even at a distance, there was something terrifying about him, a cold, calculating malevolence that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stove. The riders halted at the edge of town. Carson raised a hand in mocking greeting. "Well, well, if it isn't Sam Riley. Still alive, I see. Boss here thought you might have bled out in the desert." His voice carried easily in the tense silence. "What do you want, Carson?" Sam called back, his voice steady despite his weakened condition. It was Blackwood who answered, his voice surprisingly cultured and calm. "You know what I want, Sam. The girl. And your head on a pike." He smiled, the expression never reaching. His cold eyes. "But I'm a reasonable man. Give me the girl, and I'll let these good people live. Fight me, and well." He gestured to his men, who raised their weapons in unison. Sam stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Clara. "You know that's not going to happen, James." "Always the hero," Blackwood sneered. "Did you tell them, Sam? Did you tell these good people what you used to be? The things you did with us?" "They know enough," Sam replied, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "Do they?" Blackwood's gaze swept over the assembled townspeople. "Did he tell you about the Harmon Ranch? The Wilson stagecoach? The little mining town of Red Creek?" With each name, Sam's face grew paler. "Your savior here was once my right-hand man. The best killer I ever had." Murmurs spread through the townspeople. Clara could see doubt and fear replacing determination on many faces. "It's true," Sam said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly. "I rode with Blackwood. I did terrible things." He turned to face the townspeople. "I can't change the past, but I can try to make amends, starting here. Starting now." He turned back to Blackwood. "It ends today, James, one way or another." Blackwood laughed. "You're in no condition to fight me, Sam. Look at you, can barely stand. But I'll tell you what, I've always been a sporting man. You and me, one-on-one. If you win, we ride away and leave your precious town alone." "And if you win?" Sam asked, though he clearly knew the answer. "Then I take what's mine, the girl, the town, everything." Blackwood's cold eyes fixed on Clara. "What do you say, Sam? One last dance for old time's sake?" The townspeople broke into worried whispers. Martha stepped forward. "Don't do it, Sam. He's playing you. Even if you win, his men won't honor the deal." Sam looked from Martha to Clara, then back to Blackwood. "On one condition. We do this outside of town. Just you and me." Blackwood considered for a moment, then nodded. "Agreed. 1 hour. The flat. Ground by the creek crossing." He reined his horse around. "Don't keep me waiting, old friend." As the riders withdrew, the town erupted in argument. Some wanted to flee, others to fight. Sam silenced them with a raised hand. "Blackwood's buying time," he said. "He knows I'm wounded. He's counting on me to bleed out or collapse before I can face him." "Then don't face him," Clara insisted. "We can defend the town together." Sam shook his head. "Too many would die. Innocent people. This is between me and him. It always has been." "You can barely stand," Martha pointed out bluntly. "I don't need to stand. I just need one good shot." Sam checked his revolver, his movements deliberate despite his weakness. Clara followed him as he walked toward the edge of town. "This is suicide, Sam. You know that." He stopped, turning to face her. "Maybe, but if there's even a chance it saves you and these people, it's worth it. And what about you? Don't you deserve a chance at a life beyond revenge?" Something flickered in his eyes, longing, perhaps for a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine. "It's too late for that. It's never too late, Clara insisted, placing her hand on his arm. Not if you're still breathing. Sam covered her hand with his own. For a moment, they stood like that, connected by touch and something deeper, something neither had dared to name. If I don't come back, he said finally, go with Martha to Wyoming. Her son will protect you. I'm not planning for your death, Sam Riley, Clara replied, her voice fierce, despite the tears threatening to spill. I'm planning for your life. Our life. A sad smile touched his lips. You would have made a fine partner, Clara Richardson. Would have? I still intend to. She reached up, cupping his scarred face in her hands, and kissed him briefly, fiercely, a promise more than a farewell. When she pulled away, something had changed in Sam's expression. The resignation was gone, replaced by a steely determination. That hadn't been there before. What is it? She asked. I just realized something, he said slowly. All these years, I've been fighting to die, to find an honorable end to pay for my sins. But now, now? His gray eyes met hers, clear and certain. Now I have something to live for. As the appointed hour approached, Sam made his preparations. With a new focus, he checked and rechecked his weapons, drank water mixed with herbs Martha provided for strength, and spoke privately with several of the townsmen. When it was time, he walked alone to the meeting place, his steps measured and deliberate despite his injury. Clara watched from the edge of town, her heart in her throat, as Blackwood and his men appeared on the far side of the clearing. The two men approached each other, stopping about 20 paces apart. Even at this distance, Clara could see the contrast. Between them, Blackwood confident and smiling, Sam pale but resolute. I've waited a long time for this, Blackwood called, loud enough for the watching townspeople to hear. Not as long as I have, Sam replied. They faced each other like duelists of old, hands hovering near their weapons. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant call of a hawk. Blackwood drew first, his movement a blur of speed. But Sam was ready, dropping to one knee as he drew, and fired in a single fluid motion. The sound of gunshots echoed across the clearing. Blackwood staggered, a look of surprise on his face as he clutched his chest. But he remained standing, his own shot having gone wide. You've lost your touch, Sam, he gasped, raising his gun for another shot. Sam fired again. This time, Blackwood fell to his knees, his revolver slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. It's over, James, Sam said, rising slowly to his feet. A moment, it seemed Blackwood might accept defeat. Then, with a snarl of rage, he reached for a hidden derringer in his boot. Sam's third shot took him in the head, ending the threat forever. On the far side of the clearing, Carson and the other outlaws sat frozen in shock. Their leader was dead, killed by a wounded man they had underestimated one too many times. Sam turned to face them, his revolver still raised. It's finished, he called. Ride away now, and you live. Stay, and you join him. For a tense moment, it seemed they might charge. Then Carson reined his horse around. This ain't over, Riley, he shouted. But the threat sounded hollow. One by one, the outlaws followed Carson, riding away from Pine Haven, away from the man who had finally ended James Blackwood's reign of terror. As Sam walked back toward town, he stumbled, the last of his strength giving out now that the danger had passed. Clara ran to him, supporting him as the townspeople gathered around, cheering the man who had saved them. You did it, Clara whispered, helping him back toward Martha's Inn. We did it, he corrected her, leaning heavily on her shoulder. I couldn't have faced him without you. What happens now? She asked as they reached the porch of the inn. Sam looked out over the peaceful valley, then back at the woman beside him. For the first time since she'd met him, his eyes held hope. Now, he said, we start living. Epilogue, 6 months later. Clara stood on the porch of a small cabin overlooking a pristine lake in the Wyoming Territory. Behind her, Sam was chopping wood, his movements strong and sure, all traces of his wound healed. They had made a home here, near enough to Martha's. Son now the town marshal to feel secure, but far enough away to have the peace they both craved. Sam had taken work as a hunting guide, his knowledge of the wilderness making him highly sought after by settlers and travelers alike. Word had spread of Blackwood's death. Some of his gang had been captured by marshals. Others had scattered to the winds. Carson had been seen heading for Mexico, apparently deciding that a change of scenery was in order. As for Clara's father, they had received word that he had survived the shooting, though his recovery had been slow. He had sold the store in Silverstone and was planning to visit them in the spring. Sam finished his work and joined Clara on the porch, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. Clara leaned into him, savoring his warmth against the crisp autumn air. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. If I hadn't been kidnapped, if you hadn't found me. Some things are meant to be," Sam said simply. "Took me a long time to believe that." She turned in his arms to face him, studying the face. That had become so dear to her, still weathered and scarred, but softer now, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by contentment. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The adventure, the excitement?" Sam laughed, the sound still rare enough to be precious. "Adventure? We have a mountain lion trying to get into the chicken coop. Winter's coming on fast, and your father's visit is only months away. I'd say we have all the adventure we need." Clara smiled, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "You're right. This is exactly the adventure I want." If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Your support helps us create more exciting Western adventures just like this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Wild West.